Assalamu alaikum and a very warm welcome back to our channel Pakistan Zindabad, the next world superpower. This is episode 42, and today we're diving deep into a really crucial moment in history. We're going to explore the absolute storm of crises that marked the birth of Pakistan, drawing our insights from the fantastic book The Generals of Pakistan by Zaheer Ahmad Meer. You see, to understand Pakistan today, you absolutely have to understand how it began. And let me tell you, it began not with a quiet dawn, but with a perfect storm.
So, let's start with a question. A really simple, but honestly an almost impossible one. How do you build an entire nation from scratch when you have absolutely no money? I mean, seriously, put yourself in that position. The dream of a lifetime, an independent homeland, has just come true. There's euphoria in the streets. But behind closed doors, you, as a leader, open the national bank account, and it's practically empty. This wasn't just some academic problem. This was the brutal day one reality that would shape literally every single decision for years to come.
All right, so here's our roadmap for this explainer. First, we'll look at the moment the state was born. Then, we'll dig into what I'm calling the impossible inheritance, the terrible economic hand Pakistan was dealt. After that, we'll see how a massive, shocking refugee crisis slammed into the country. And finally, we'll connect the dots to see how all of this forced defense to become the absolute top priority, and how that, in turn, created a new and powerful administrative backbone for the entire nation.
Let's go back to August 1947. Can you imagine the feeling? For millions of people, it was a moment of just pure, unparalleled joy. Finally, a country to call their own. The air was thick with hope, with promise, with dreams of a bright new future. But, and this is a huge but, underneath all of that incredible hope was a foundation of unbelievable hardship. The new state of Pakistan wasn't just starting from zero. No, in many ways, it was starting deep in the negative, facing these staggering existential challenges from the very second that green and white flag was raised for the first time.
So let's talk about that starting in the negative part. What did that actually look like on paper? Well, the first crisis, the one that hit immediately, was economic. It was a crisis of inheritance, a fundamental, structural imbalance in the nation's finances that made the simple act of governing seem, well, almost impossible. This wasn't just a case of a tight budget. This was an equation for national survival that, from the outset, simply did not add up.
So here's the first number in that broken equation. 17%. At the time of partition, Pakistan inherited only 17% of British India's total revenue-generating assets. Now let that sink in for a moment. All the factories, the railways, the taxable land, the entire economic engine of the subcontinent. Pakistan got just 17% of the income stream. That is a tiny slice of the pie to run a brand new country with tens of millions of people.
Okay, so you've got that 17% number in your head. Well, now look at the other side of the ledger. While the income was tiny, the responsibilities were huge. Right away, Pakistan was saddled with 33% of the entire security burden of the former British Indian Army. We're talking about defending vast new borders, maintaining a large military force, all of that. It's a massive mismatch. You're getting less than a fifth of the income, but you're being handed a third of the bills. It just doesn't work.
And this right here, this slide lays out the core dilemma perfectly. It's the foundational deficit. On one side of the scale, you have this tiny, almost insignificant revenue base of 17%. On the other side, you have this huge, heavy weight of a 33% security burden needed to protect a new and very vulnerable nation. This wasn't just a temporary problem. This structural deficit was baked into the state's DNA from day one. It meant that there was never, ever going to be enough money to go around. Extremely difficult choices were not just likely, they were absolutely inevitable.
This quote from our source, The Generals of Pakistan, just cuts right to the heart of it. Let's break that down. Economically weak, that's a polite way of saying broke. It means you can't afford to build the schools, the hospitals, the roads, all the things a new nation desperately needs. Then there's strategically exposed. That means you have immediate, real-world security threats on your borders that you simply cannot ignore. So what do? When you're cornered by these two brutal realities, what gets priority? Do you build for the future, or do you fight to survive the present?
And just when you think the situation couldn't possibly get any worse, it did. That already impossible economic equation was about to be completely shattered by a second, simultaneous crisis. A crisis of people. A human catastrophe was unfolding at a scale that was hard to comprehend. The partition of India had unleashed one of the largest and most violent mass migrations in all of human history, and the new, financially starved state of Pakistan was right at the epicenter of this massive storm.
7 million. Just look at that number, 7 million.
In the first 2 years of its existence, 7 million desperate, broken, and destitute refugees poured across the new border into West Pakistan. To put that into perspective, that's more than the entire population of many countries today. These weren't just immigrants looking for a better life. These were people who had lost literally everything: their homes, their land, their businesses, and in far too many cases, their families. They arrived with only the clothes on their backs, in desperate need of everything: food, water, shelter, medicine, and security.
The impact of this human wave was immediate, and it was devastating. The new nation was simply completely overwhelmed. It triggered massive food shortages because how do you feed millions of unexpected guests overnight? There was no industrial base to speak of, so there were no jobs for these millions of new citizens, and maybe most critically, the brand new civil administration, all the government offices, the local police, the people who were supposed to manage a country, it just collapsed. It crumbled under the sheer crushing weight of this unbelievable humanitarian disaster.
So let's just take a breath and recap the situation. Crisis number 1, your national treasury is empty. You're broke. Crisis number 2, your country is flooded with 7 million refugees and your civil government has effectively collapsed. These aren't small problems. These are existential threats. So the leadership had to make a pivotal choice. With the few resources you have left, where do you put your energy? What becomes the single most important priority for a state that is teetering right on the brink of complete and total failure?
And the answer they arrived at was stark, but in their eyes, unavoidable. Defense had to come first. The logic was grim, but it was simple. Without secure borders and without internal law and order, there would be no Pakistan left to save. The economic problems, the humanitarian crisis, as terrible as they were, they couldn't even begin to be addressed if the state itself ceased to exist. So protecting the integrity and sovereignty of the nation became the one overriding absolute imperative.
Now, this critical decision to prioritize defense above all else, when combined with the fact that the civilian government was collapsing, created a huge power vacuum. Think about it. All the basic functions of a state, distributing food, setting up refugee camps, maintaining order in the streets, even just basic logistics, they just weren't happening. The system was broken. Someone, some institution had to step into that void and get things done.
You can see it as a clear, logical progression, a chain of cause and effect. First, the brand new, understaffed civil administration just buckles under the impossible strain of the refugee crisis. It grinds to a halt. Second, with chaos threatening to erupt everywhere, the leaders turn to the only institution in the entire country that had the discipline, the organization, and the nationwide reach to manage a crisis on this scale: the army. The military is called in to provide essential services and restore order. And that leads directly to the third step. The military's role fundamentally expands. It's no longer just a defense force for the borders. It's now an essential part of running the country itself.
And this quote from the book just summarizes the whole transformation perfectly. Out of the fire of these founding crises, the Army's entire function evolved, not because of a grand plan, but out of sheer, desperate necessity. It wasn't just about security anymore. It became about logistics, about administration, about nation building. It became the steel framework, the administrative backbone that held the fragile newborn state together when pretty much everything else was threatening to fall apart. So this all leaves us with a really powerful, lingering question. The decisions made in the chaos of 1947 were reactions. They were desperate measures for desperate times. But they set a precedent. When an institution that is built for war and defense becomes the very backbone of a nation's administration, what does that mean for its future? What are the long-term consequences for its politics, for its society, and for its national identity? That's the question that echoes from Pakistan's birth.
When you think of Pakistan, it's almost impossible not to think of its military. The two seem so deeply intertwined. But have you ever stopped to ask why? How did that powerful relationship even begin? Well, today we're going to peel back the layers of history. We're going right back to the very start to understand how this foundation was laid and how it built a fortress that would go on to define a nation. So let's start with the big question right up front. Why is Pakistan's military so incredibly central to its national identity? I mean, this goes way beyond just defense policy, right? It's really at the very heart of what it means to be Pakistan. And to get to the bottom of it, we have to journey back to the country's chaotic and, frankly, violent birth. Okay, so our story really kicks off in 1947. This was a moment of just immense turmoil. You see, the partition of British India wasn't some neat, orderly process. It was violent, it was chaotic, and for the brand new nation of Pakistan, it was what you could only call a hostile birth. And it's this environment that would forge what we now call a fortress mentality right from day one.
And this, right here, is the absolute crucial point to grasp. From the very second it came into existence, Pakistan was on the defensive. It wasn't just a new country trying to figure things out, it was a new country that felt like it was fighting for its very life. The environment was seen as actively, aggressively hostile. And that struggle for simple survival, it was immediate, and it was all-consuming.
Just look at the challenges piling up. They weren't small hurdles, they were existential threats. For starters, India withheld Pakistan's share of financial assets. I mean, can you imagine? That's a crippling blow for a brand new economy just trying to get on its feet. Then you have the borders. These weren't just lines on a map. They were unstable, insecure, and the site of horrific violence and mass migrations. On top of all that, you had the princely states, Junagadh, Hyderabad, and of course, the big one, Kashmir. They all became immediate flashpoints for conflict. You really have to try and imagine being a leader trying to build a nation under that kind of immense, relentless pressure.
So when you're faced with that kind of overwhelming pressure, what happens? A new philosophy, a new way of thinking, begins to take hold. And look, this wasn't some academic theory cooked up in a quiet university library. No, this was a doctrine of pure, raw survival, born directly out of the crucible of that initial crisis.
And that thinking was captured perfectly by Pakistan's early leaders in this one simple sentence. Survival without a strong army is impossible. I mean, it doesn't get much more blunt or absolute than that, does it? This wasn't just a preference or a policy choice. In their minds, a powerful army was the precondition for the nation's very existence. It was that simple.
And this powerful idea, it wasn't just a fleeting thought. It solidified into what we can properly call a foundational doctrine. This became the core, unshakable belief that a strong military wasn't just, a nice thing to have. No, it was absolutely essential for the nation's very existence. This wasn't just another policy. This became the bedrock, the very cornerstone of Pakistan's strategic thinking for decades to come.
So if that hostile birth created the need for a strong military, it was one specific conflict that would forge its identity. We're talking, of course, about Kashmir. This was the defining crucible, the trial by fire that would shape the new Pakistani army and cement its place in the heart of the nation.
It's hard to overstate this. The 1947-48 Kashmir conflict shaped the Pakistani military's psychology more than any other single event in its history. This wasn't just another border skirmish. For the army, this was the conflict that embedded a sense of perpetual threat, a siege mentality, deep within its institutional DNA. It became part of who they were.
And the transformation was just profound. Think about it. Before the war in Kashmir, the army was a brand new institution, still kind of finding its feet, trying to figure out its real purpose in this new country. But after the war, its role became crystal clear: national defense. Its very identity shifted. It went from being this new, untested force to, in the eyes of many, the nation's savior. It was without a doubt its defining moment.
Now, this new identity wasn't just a temporary thing. It wasn't a phase. It created an enduring military identity, a legacy that, you can argue, continues to shape the nation to this day. That conflict in Kashmir had very specific, very lasting consequences for the army as an institution.
So let's break that down. The Kashmir War really did three crucial things for the army. First, it gave them a clear, undeniable purpose: defend the nation against what they saw as an existential threat. Second, it gave them legitimacy. It validated their central role in the states, making the army an indispensable institution. And third, it forged that distinct and powerful identity as the ultimate guardian, the final protector of the nation's sovereignty and its ideology.
And from this, two core national beliefs started to become deeply ingrained in the country's psyche. First, the conviction that the military must remain central to national defense. And second, this idea that the military is also essential for political stability, a belief that would, of course, have profound and complicated implications for Pakistan's democratic journey. These weren't just opinions. They became pillars of the national mindset.
So what's the big takeaway here? You can basically draw a straight line from Pakistan's hostile birth directly to its enduring fortress identity. That initial sense of existential threat led to a doctrine of survival that put the military at its very center. And then the Kashmir War came along and cemented that doctrine, hardening it into a powerful, lasting identity, built brick by brick out of crisis.
And that leaves us with a final and pretty profound question to think about. The very identity of Pakistan's military, as we've seen, was forged in the fires of conflict and existential threat. So, when a nation's identity is so deeply and fundamentally intertwined with conflict, what does the path to a lasting peace even look like? And what does it mean for a country to live in what feels like a perpetual state of defense?
Welcome to our explainer. Today, we're diving into a really fascinating paradox, using insights from Zaheer Ahmad Meer's book, The Generals of Pakistan. And the paradox is this: how does a nation born on the absolute edge of collapse end up creating one of its most powerful and lasting institutions? We're going to explore the argument for how the Pakistani military became so central to the country's identity, not years down the line, but from its very first chaotic day. So, this is the big question, isn't it? This is what's at the heart of the whole story. It just doesn't seem to make sense. How can a state born in a moment of near total weakness, a state that had practically nothing, produce one of the most powerful institutions in the country? Well, the answer, according to our source, isn't really about a simple grab for power. It's about the desperate, brutal realities of a nation's birth. Let's dig in. To really get this, we have to go all the way back to the beginning, 1947. You know, the birth of Pakistan wasn't just a little bit difficult, it was a complete, perfect storm of crises. Seriously, imagine trying to build a brand new house in the middle of a hurricane, an earthquake, and a wildfire, all happening at the exact same time. From its very first breath, the new nation was literally fighting for its own survival. And look, we're not talking about abstract problems on a spreadsheet here. Empty coffers, that meant the government had no money, like zero. It couldn't pay anyone, couldn't buy anything. At that exact same moment, it was dealing with one of the biggest, most traumatic mass migrations in human history. Millions of desperate, terrified refugees pouring over the border, needing food, shelter, everything. And as if that wasn't enough to completely break a new government, a full-blown war explodes with India over Kashmir. Any one of these things could have destroyed a new country. Pakistan got hit with all three at once. So, with all these fires raging on the outside, you'd hope, right? You'd hope for a strong, steady hand on the wheel on the inside to guide the country through it. But according to the story laid out in the book, the exact opposite happened. The chaos outside was matched by a total crisis of leadership inside, creating this incredibly dangerous power vacuum, right when the country needed decisive leadership the most. And here's why. The two pillars that are supposed to hold up a state were basically crumbling. On one hand, you had the political leadership. These were the guys who led the independence movement, but now they were apparently fractured, divided, and just couldn't get a unified response together. And at the same time, the steep bureaucracy, the civil service, the people who actually make a country run, it was brand new, it was weak, it was totally underdeveloped. It just wasn't ready to handle an emergency on this scale. It was kind of like the lights were on, but nobody was home. And into this void, into this vacuum, stepped one organization. In the middle of all the political chaos and the administrative collapse, there was one single institution that was already organized. It had discipline, it had a clear chain of command, a structure inherited from the British era, and that was the army. It was pretty much the only part of the new state that actually worked from day one. Okay, let's stop here for a second, because this quote, this is the whole game changer. The most important words here aren't only disciplined, they're nation building. See, the army wasn't just being asked to defend the nation on the front lines in Kashmir, it was being asked to do jobs that are almost always civilian jobs. We're talking managing refugee camps, securing supply lines for food, even just setting up basic law and order in some areas. Because the civilian state couldn't do it, the army was seen as the only force that could hold the country together and literally build it. And this moment, this decision, it did so much more than just solve the immediate problems. The book's thesis argues that this fundamentally rewrote the nation's DNA. This wasn't just a temporary emergency plan, no, this was a foundational act. The army's role went from being a tool of the state to becoming the very foundation for the state. It set a pattern that would repeat for decades to come. When civilian government stumbles, the military is there to step in. Now, this timeline just lays it out perfectly. You can see the direct line. The state's weakness in 47, the war in 48, those things created the reason for the Army's central role. And for about a decade, that power was informal, but everyone knew it was there. Then, just over 10 years later, in 1958, that informal power becomes formal with the country's first military coup. So you see, it wasn't some sudden event. It was the end of a path that was paved in those very first years of independence. And this brings us to this really critical concept from the source material, what's called the backbone identity. Now, this isn't just a cool metaphor, it's a core belief system, an ideology that was forged in the fire of 1947. It's the idea that without a strong, powerful military at its center, the very existence of Pakistan is in danger. This became the institution's own view of itself, and for a lot of people, it became the accepted story of how the nation survived. And this quote just nails it, doesn't it? It perfectly captures the lesson that was learned from that incredibly chaotic first decade. It wasn't just a slogan for the military, it became a kind of political truth that seemed to explain how Pakistan made it through against impossible odds. It's an idea that got woven right into the national consciousness. But here's the thing, this foundational idea, this backbone identity, it wasn't just some temporary fix for the 1950s. No way. As we're about to see, it became a permanent, defining feature of the country's entire power structure. It created a legacy that was passed down from one generation of generals to the next, becoming a core part of the institution's DNA. And you can really see how this legacy was built, kind of in 3 steps. First, the identity is born out of pure necessity, in that initial crisis we talked about. Second, that identity gets institutionalized. It gets baked into the military's culture, its training, its whole way of thinking. It becomes part of what it means to be an officer. And third, because it's so deeply embedded, it naturally shapes how every single general after that sees the world, how they define threats, and what they believe is in the national interest. All right, so let's boil it all down. The argument that Zaheer Ahmad Meer presents is that the military's central role in Pakistan wasn't just a simple power grab. It was the direct result of a total collapse of the civilian state right at the beginning. That collapse created a vacuum that only the army could fill, and in filling it, the army created this identity for itself as the nation's backbone, an identity that would define the country's power struggles for decades to come. And that leaves us with one last thing to think about, a really important question that comes right out of this whole analysis. If one institution is seen as the backbone, right, the essential structure holding the whole country up, what does that mean for everything else? What does that imply about the role and the strength and the future of all the other parts of the body politic? Something to chew on. Thanks for joining.